This video was sponsored by ExpressVPN. In my original 2019 video, I called the first half of Scott Derrickson and Robert Cargill's Sinister one of the greatest top-tier horror movies I have ever experienced. From its profoundly bone-chilling opening to Ethan Hawke's mesmerizing performance to every unspeakably horrifying snuff film he discovers, I cannot recommend it enough as a masterfully intense murder mystery that gets so deep under your skin it's difficult to forget what you've just witnessed. However, it kinda shits the bed in the second half, when it turns into a spooky haunted house of creepy kids and jump scares that turn this otherwise mature investigative thriller into disappointing cheap tricks that partially detract from its hypnotic subdued mystique. Now, I am aware many people will heavily disagree with me on that part, and I don't want to talk down to the film due to its unique setup and ambitious supernatural creation, but upon later rewatches, I was so let down by its ending, especially that silly final jump scare, that I just couldn't bring myself to properly commit to its sequel. So let's see how forgiving I actually am. Sitting down and actually giving Sinister 2 my undivided attention, I would be lying if I said I wasn't expecting the worst, considering it felt like a sequel created purely for the purposes of banking off the original success, without any real meaningful desire to continue the story. With that said, having Derrickson and Cargill return as writers maintains both faithfulness and consistency, while passing over directing duties to Kieran Foy, who proves an appropriate match to Derrickson's style, given Voy's previous film, the brilliant psychological horror Citadel, struck a similar balance between realism and the supernatural. The story is pretty much a direct continuation from the first film, with the supporting comic relief deputy so-and-so taking on the reins as our main protagonist because, well, spoiler alert, he's the sole survivor of the original. While remaining nameless to reflect the snarky comedic sensibilities of Ellison's character from the first film, the deputy has now inherited Ellison's obsession with a string of unsolved murders that feature the same recurring pattern involving a senselessly executed family and a single missing child. The deputy now takes it upon himself to destroy each of the houses in which the murders take place in order to end the cursed cycle of a supernatural entity revealed to be responsible for the killings known as Bughuul, who retains its power by indoctrinating one of the family's children into murder and recording said murder on an 8mm camera, before taking their soul into what I assume is a netherrealm of sorts. Obviously it helps if you're familiar with the original, because while the film does get you up to speed with how the evil works, personally I think it's better to experience the slow burn reveal that Ellison goes through. I just think it helps better ease you into the madness of it all, because the more it starts to tell you about Bughuul and his shenanigans, the less, sinister it slowly becomes. Now, personally, I preferred the original when it retained its ambiguity, but I respect its need to develop something for the payoff. It's just that I felt that the outcome doesn't meet the heights of anticipation that are broodingly built throughout. Regardless, going into the sequel, I reluctantly but understandably put my differences aside and accepted that the supernatural component was inevitably going to take precedent, given it can't exactly regurgitate a mystery that's already been revealed. However, that poses the problem of what else the film has to offer, given its later exposition dump is virtually a retread of the originals, but with the addition of how to defeat Bughuul, which we'll come back to in the major spoiler section. Generally speaking, yes, it's an all-round inferior sequel because there's simply nothing left to shock or surprise you. That's of course if the snuff films are at the very least as haunting and as brutal as ever, which they kind of are, so I guess we're going to start with the main attraction. But just before we go any further, here's a quick word from this video sponsor, ExpressVPN. So when you're just casually venturing across the internet, it's easy to forget how many websites lack suitable protection against hackers attempting to steal your private information. This is especially true when using unencrypted public Wi-Fi for even the most common websites, where your passwords, financial details, and even your emails could be under threat. That's why I always stay connected to ExpressVPN. With a simple press of a button, ExpressVPN uses best-in-class encryption and IP masking to ensure your data cannot be seen by any unwanted parties. When I'm traveling and staying in hotels, using ExpressVPN gives me the safety and security to work privately and undisturbed, especially when I'm doing research for a video and end up on some dodgy old website that likely hasn't been protected in years. With how sneaky even the least tech-savvy people are these days, it's simply not worth taking the risk when you realize how much crucial personal information you likely have stored online. Without ExpressVPN to provide security, it's like driving a car without insurance, or forgetting to mute yourself during a work call and everyone hears you telling your housemate something embarrassing. ExpressVPN has been rated #1 by several tech critics and uses trusted server technology to ensure it's physically impossible for even their servers to store your information. So guarantee your online security today and find out how you can get 3 months free by visiting expressvpn.com/Ryan. The murder tapes, as I'll call them, are still vile and diabolical as ever to hammer home how ruthless and mean-spirited Bagul is. For example, the opening cornfield crucifixion is effective at setting the unpleasant and uncompromising tone, while the music used in the Christmas Day Frozen Burial adds this fierce, tragic edge to each tape's transition from happy home video to demonic otherworld, reminding you that there's nothing fun in watching an innocent, happy family just suddenly become victims to an unprovoked slaying. Granted, I feel it's missing that sense of morbid curiosity where you question why you want to dig deeper down such an uncomfortable rabbit hole like Ellison's character did, so you could say there's far less of an allure to its use outside being provocative for provocative's sake. Frankly, for as grim as the tapes inherently are, the core issue is that none of them match the suffocating simplicity of the original, and the evil just becomes less engrossing the second time around. They're more showy and excessive, bordering on torture porn territory rather than violence designed to invoke suffering. This is a really fucked up way to describe it, but the tapes involving a family being eaten by alligators or having their face drilled off in a dental chair or forcing rats to burrow into people's stomachs, which, don't get me wrong, is completely disturbing, but it lacks the nuance of the hanging or that goddamn lawnmower scene in the first film. It's also that small detail of leaving very little to the imagination and not having Ellison's reactions to humanize the journey we take alongside him, which itself was a clever stylistic choice inspired by the snuff neo-noir thriller 8mm, which I've also covered in case you want to check that out. It sort of answers the scrutiny I get in the comments where I find one thing distressingly violent but not another more overtly apparent one. For me, it comes down to the cerebral context of what makes something provocative. In the case of Sinister, both movies are grim and disturbing, yes, but the emotional difference between them is that the first emphasizes depravity, the other focuses on gratuity. One is designed to realistically reflect violence and give it continuous presence through Ellison's story. The other just wants to project it without true lasting impact. Although, like I said earlier, I cannot go into the sequel expecting it to have the same realism as the original's first half, given the mystery is already revealed, especially considering how quickly it throws creepy ghost children and Bagul in your face right from the opening. That opening crucifixion is effective like the original's hanging, but the distinction is that while the original withholds further context and slowly builds a sense of dread, the sequel literally cuts to the chosen killer child Dylan experiencing a few ineffectual jump scares that utterly dilute the power of the cold, quiet opening. It gave me a bad omen for what's to come, because the creepy dead kids in the original just didn't do anything for me, and their silly Children of the Corn-like appearance in the sequel, where they frequently torment and taunt Dylan, is probably its worst part. However, here's the thing, I really came to appreciate how the sequel cleverly complements the original by respecting the fact that it is a direct sequel, and thus having no need to withhold any information from the audience. As such, while you have the deputy storyline of him trying to save the next set of victims, there's actually just as much attention placed on the second plot involving Dylan being slowly indoctrinated into killing his family. It doesn't hide its conceit, the threat is always out in the opening, and while yes, it absolutely diminishes the impact because there's nothing to surprise us, it at least provides an interesting subversion to a film that was going to exist whether its creators wanted it to or not. Like I said in the beginning, having the creators write the film means it doesn't contradict itself. In fact, it spends just as much time addressing unanswered questions and plot holes from the original, like how is it possible for one small child to incapacitate their entire family and set up elaborate death traps. I mean, when I first saw it, I just assumed it was supernatural assistance, and all the sequel does is outright confirms that by showing that the supernatural children have a physical presence in the world. I respect for the purposes of a sequel, it's not like they really had a choice, and it seemed better just to pander to unanswered questions to satisfy audiences who wanted to see the film. When it actually comes to the scares themselves, while they're not carried by the same powerfully relentless feeling of oppression Ellison goes through, treating them as James Wan-like popcorn scares, which to be fair, the original was abundantly present with them, they're okay to be honest. There's one scene in particular where the deputy is alone in his motel room and gets stalked by Bughuul, which stands out as the best scare in the film, while everything else, at the very least, services the requirement of a mainstream horror movie. If I'm being really generous, I actually think I like the more subdued supernatural direction in the sequel more than when Derrickson did it. It's not as telegraphed or as elaborate to the point of being silly to me, and when it comes down to it, if you took Derrickson's direction with the murder mystery and combined it with Kieran Foy's approach to the supernatural stuff, Sinister would be absolutely perfect. Now, moving into the human drama, I have to lightly commend the film for attempting to jump on the whole subtextual bandwagon that was emerging at the time by making Sinister 2's horror more thematically relevant to its story, even if it goes against the tone of the original. Sinister 2 treads around a family drama about abuse, with Dylan, his brother Zach, and his mother Courtney squatting in a farmhouse connected to an abandoned church where previous murders took place. We learn that Courtney has fled with her 2 kids away from her abusive ex, who's attempting to obtain a court order to take back his family. Throughout this exchange, the deputy becomes more intimate with the family and effectively acts as this sensitive, caring father figure that the family truly need. It works on the strength of James Ranzone's humble performance. He's quirky, awkward, friendly, and endearing, and there's now a tragedy built around his character where he became a suspect in Ellison and his family's murder, leading him to losing his job and becoming a fragile, distressed shell of a man who is in need of a good hug. The poor bastard is lonely and scared, and it plays on the desperation that I hoped he would get out of this alive, creating a legitimate anxiety that matches how Hawk projected personality onto Ellison. In fact, I really like how Ranzone's performance goes against the characteristic strong, confident leading man type to give us something more timid and sincere. With Dylan's story, we witness him being frequently exposed to the murder tapes as he tries to resist his violent urges, effectively turning into something allegorical after revealing that Dylan was previously hospitalized after the physical abuse he suffered at the hands of his father. He basically has PTSD, making his fragile state weaker to Bughuul's power. I guess you could say it adds that missing emotional weight to the murders, but I still feel it disregards the original's nihilism, where it fit the true crime influences of random unresolved murders and dismantling the contemporary myth that every evil has a weakness. By the way, at this point, I want to go into spoilers, so consider this your final warning if you want to check out Sinister 2 for yourself. For everyone else, brace yourself. So, you could defend the film's focus on gratuity as a means to desensitize and possess Dylan into murder, yet it doesn't do anything further with the idea, besides explain how Bughuul's powers are fueled by the aesthetic observance of violence, which is such a great pretentious writer's line that I would also attempt to put it in my script. Essentially, the deputy learns that Bughuul can be summoned with totems that symbolize and perpetuate violence and suffering, such as an old 70s Norwegian ham radio that plays the screams of a dying family, or in the case of both films, the 8mm camera. As such, by destroying said totems, it should prevent Bughuul from existing, yet, while all that is unfolding, the film decides to throw in a jarring plot twist that makes absolutely no sense. It pretty much sets up Dylan to be the killer, while his brother Zach becomes jealous and increasingly violent as a result. But when Dylan finally flatly refuses to do Bughuul's bidding, the dead kids are basically like, well, fuck you, we preferred your brother anyway, and you were just a red herring, lol. Like, it makes sense that the filmmakers want to deceive the audience, but it falls apart when you realize the kids outright say they never intended Dylan to be the killer, so what the fuck was the point in any of that? If anything, the twist does a massive disservice to the outcome because we're more sympathetically attached to Dylan than Zach, so when the abusive ex gets his family back via court order and we watch Zach now planning the murders unbeknownst to them, all it's done is take away its one emotional draw. However, I will say the reveal that the burning scarecrows from the opening are actually the family we've spent the entire movie with, and it's admittedly satisfying to see the abusive ex eat shit while Dylan and Courtney are saved by the deputy. I also appreciate how it recontextualizes the whole happy family segment from the murder tapes, given what we see of the family prior to the murder attempt is an abusive scenario where Courtney and Dylan are only there by force. After all of that, the ending still sucks. We end up having a 5-minute Scooby-Doo chase montage around the house where the ghosts help Zach hunt down the survivors, eventually leading to the deputy destroying the camera and ending Bughuul's current reign of terror. They then pull a drag me to hell type shocker by having Bughuul disintegrate Zach into the nether realm for his failure to kill the family, and just as the deputy plans to leave town, the ham radio respawns Bughuul and, well, what the fuck else were you expecting? If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, consider liking and subscribing if you haven't done so already, and until next time, stay safe, stay away from murderous camera-wielding children, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!